If you've been online recently, you've probably heard the claim that white culture doesn't exist. Some see this as a simple fact about history, and others call it misleading or even offensive. But what do people really mean by this? And is it true that a racial category like white can lack a culture of its own? Today we're going to unpack this debate, looking at how Black American culture formed, for example, but why white culture didn't. The argument for white culture not existing is based on the belief that white people as a collective do not have a singular culture or cultural beliefs that transcend geography, age, nationality, and is based on their racial identity as white people. To understand what this truly means, we first have to look at other racial cultures, specifically in the context of the US, because that is where this claim originates. People that make the claim that white culture doesn't exist will still say something like black culture does exist. Well, why do they believe this? We have to look at the history of African Americans first. When African slaves were brought to the USA during the transatlantic slave trade, these African people of multiple different cultures and backgrounds were quite different from each other linguistically and culturally. In places like the Caribbean, or even for groups like the Gullah Geechee of the United States, this linguistic difference ended up in the development of an English-based Creole language that still exists today, as these African people had to speak English as a common language between slaves and slave masters. They developed a pidgin language, and over generations this pidgin became an English Creole, resulting in languages like Jamaican Patois. In the USA outside of the Gullah, this didn't really happen. Rather, a dialect or language formed called AAVE, or African American Vernacular English, which was from slaves picking up the dialect of English spoken by white English overseers or indentured servants, and also just poor white people in the South in general. Black slaves learned this form of English, resulting in modern AAVE. Anyways, as time went on in the South, where the majority of black people lived due to slavery, a unique African American culture developed. This was a culture specific to black Americans. They were stripped of their African heritage and around many other African groups, so over time they created their own culture. This was the development of black culture in the USA. And after slavery, most black people stayed in the South, mostly in black majority towns. The reason this is black culture is because of the shared history of these people. Being almost exclusively in the South, being descendants of the slave trade, slavery in the USA, mostly living in the Black Belt, they were a minority developing a specific culture over time. After slavery, as Jim Crow laws took effect, the Great Migration happened where millions of black people left the South, going all over the USA. They took this black culture with them. They took AAVE with them. Like, why is it that a black person from Milwaukee has a similar speech pattern or says similar phrases as a black person from Seattle or LA or Texas or Atlanta? Although they speak very differently, it's very similar in many ways. This is because this is AAVE. It traveled with them. Like many other aspects of their culture traveled with them. African Americans trace their cultural origins, their ethnogenesis to the South, and this is where black culture comes from. There is a singular region of origin. Okay, so why don't white people have white culture then? When people say white culture doesn't exist, they are not saying that white people don't have cultures. French culture, Sicilian culture, Norwegian culture, English culture all exist, but a more unifying white racial culture doesn't exist for two reasons. The first reason is because white culture in the USA doesn't have a singular starting point. Landing on Plymouth Rock doesn't signify white culture. Whiteness didn't even truly exist at the time as a term for race. White Americans are made up of many different ethnic groups that migrated to different parts of the USA at different rates at different times, and were central to the creation of the cultures of those regions. If you go to the South, there's more DNA from the British Isles, a lot of English, Irish, and Scottish ancestry. If you go to the Northeast, there are higher rates of German ancestry as well as more Italian and Polish ancestry compared to the South or the Midwest. These groups were not stripped of their cultures, forced to create a new one. They assimilated and impacted the cultures in the places they lived. Predominantly white cultures in the USA exist. The culture of New England, the South, Pacific Northwest, Midwest, they can all be considered in many ways white cultures, but only due to the fact that many times the majority of the makeup of these cultures are white people historically. White culture, on the other hand, is a different thing. White Americans connect a lot more with American culture rather than a white culture. Because when a people group is the majority, in this case racially, they are seen as the dominant people and identify more specifically with the culture of the nation or their region. White Americans see themselves as American. A general American culture does exist. When it comes to minorities like black people in this case, they will identify much more with black culture first than American culture. They will see themselves as black first before American because historically American has been somewhat synonymous with white. Racial minorities are usually more aware of their race than people of the dominant racial group, and therefore racial identity many times forms around that. And if they were systemically discriminated against, isolated, they will form a unique identity. This is why Chicano culture exists. This is why res culture exists. These are racial creations. If a Chinese man lives in Ghana, his racial identity as someone from East Asia will be on their conscience much more than a Ghanaian black man in Ghana. The Ghanaian black man may rarely ever think of being a black person, as they are the majority. And if there is an East Asian community in Ghana that this Chinese person is a part of, that has lived there for generations, and let's say they were forced to live segregated from the rest of society like black Americans were, then a specific East Asian culture will develop in Ghana. In Ghana, however, black culture won't exist, as long as black people are the majority. However, a native East Asian culture will develop. Many white cultures exist, whether that's in the USA or Europe, but unifying white culture does not, because white Americans often identify more with regional or national cultures than with a unified racial culture. White Americans historically blended into the broader national and regional cultures rather than forming a distinct identity tied to race. Black culture, on the other hand, developed from a shared history of displacement and oppression and resilience. So while there are many white ethnic and regional cultures, there isn't one unified white culture.